Alright, so this video is going to look at the case of a tariff in a small nation. And so this is the big video, this is a big case to consider to understand how various forms of trade protection impact or disrupt the economics of free trade. There are a lot of different forms of trade protection. There's quotas, voluntary export restraints, non-tariff barriers. But if you understand what's going on in the case of the tariff, you can understand what's going on with those other ones as well. And the small nation case is the easiest one in which to see this. There's an interesting addition to, with a large nation. We'll worry about that in a separate video. So we're going to take the small nation case, and then we want to compare the equilibrium with no trade, with no tariff. So that will be the free trade equilibrium, and then the equilibrium that we would observe with the tariff in place. So we first have to do the free trade equilibrium and then figure out what's going to happen with the tariff. So you have a horizontal world supply curve drawn here, so we can see that this is a small nation, and the equilibrium in free trade would simply be the price that world supply curve is drawn, and that is PW. That's going to be the price, and then it's the quantity demand, where the price where quantity demand equals quantity supplied. Well, the total quantity supplied that consumers are going to want to demand is over here, where this world supply curve intersects the domestic demand curve. That's here. So that will give us a quantity. Oh, I would want to call this Q2. So we'll call that Q2 simply because I'm going to call the quantity that the domestic producers will want to supply Q1. So we're Q1. So we take the world supply curve, we draw over to the domestic supply curve. That intersects here, so the price of PW, domestic suppliers want to supply Q1 units of steel, and then at this price, domestic consumers want to buy Q2 units of steel, but they can because we have supply from the rest of the world. And this nation is small enough that this amount that they want to import is not going to drive up the world price of steel. So we can begin to describe the equilibrium here with free trade. The price is PW. The consumption is Q2 here, so we'll write that there. Domestic supply is Q1. And then the imports, well, that would be Q2 minus Q1. And we'll hold off for a consumer and producer surplus because we want to first draw in what's going to happen with the tariff. A tariff is a commodity tax. And in principles of microeconomics, when we go over a commodity tax, we say that if you have a commodity tax and you impose it on the sellers of the good, that would shift the supply curve by the amount of the tax. You would shift the supply curve up by the amount of the tax. If you were putting a $1 a loaf tax on bread, you shift the supply curve up by $1. We're thinking about putting a tariff on steel here, so it's going the amount of the tariff per unit of steel, say per ton of steel, is going to be the amount that we shift the supply curve up. So we're drawing on that, how a commodity tax impacts supply and demand. It impacts on the supply side, doesn't affect this domestic demand, it doesn't affect the demand curve. So no impact on the demand side. We're going to say that this tax falls on the supply side. But a tariff is a discriminating tax. It doesn't tax all steel, it only taxes imported steel. So domestic suppliers of steel don't have to worry about paying this commodity tax. If this was a tax on gasoline, and just on gasoline, then domestic oil companies, domestic gas companies would have to pay it, but then also imported oil would have to pay it. But this is not a tax on steel, it's a tax on imported steel. The tariff is a discriminatory tax. It's a commodity tax, but it only applies to those units that get imported. So nothing happens to the demand curve, nothing happens to the domestic supply curve, but the world supply curve will shift up, and it's going to shift up by the amount of the tariff. So we're going to draw in a second horizontal supply curve. It will be higher than the other one because it has to cover not just the costs of the rest of the world reflected here, but also then the tariff. And we'll call the tariff amount T. And that's this vertical distance here between these curves. This is the dollar amount of the tariff per unit of steel. So we have the tariff reflected here. Now, because this is a small nation, this is still a horizontal supply curve. So if you didn't have this first supply curve in here, it would be as if we were getting the equilibrium as we did before. But we simply have a different supply curve. It's a little bit higher. So the price will be at PW plus T, the amount of the tariff. And then we would get the domestic consumption production by taking this price here, reading over to the domestic supply curve. That's there. Come down here. That'll give us Q3. And we keep reading over to the domestic demand curve, and that'll give us Q4, the quantity consumed with the tariff. So we can come over here and say, okay, with the tariff now we have PW plus T, the consumption will be Q4, domestic supply Q3, and then the imports are Q4 minus Q3. So the price goes up, the consumption goes down, domestic production goes up, and the amount of the imports go down. And that makes sense because there's an old saying in economics, if you tax anything, you get less of it. If a tariff is a tax on imports, when we compare the equilibrium, we will have a smaller quantity of imports, and we have it here. Here are the imports with free trade. Here's the imports with the tariff in place, and we can see that since both both quantities have changed in the same direction, the amount of imports are clearly smaller. Now we have to do the consumer and producer surplus. So those are areas, and so I will put numbers on here to correspond to the areas that we have. And we're going to need those areas, so I have them labeled now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Consumer surplus, to find it on the supply and demand graph, you take the area that's below the demand curve and above the price. In free trade, the price is PW, and so what's below the domestic demand curve and above the price, that's this here. If that demand curve is linear, then this is a triangle, and we see that we have areas 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 in the consumer surplus. And then we would have, with free trade, we'd have a producer surplus would be the area that's below the price and above the supply curve, above the domestic supply curve. Here's the free trade price, there's the domestic supply curve. We've got area 7. Now we go to the tariff, and the tariff is consumer surplus is the area that's below the price. Again, it's the area that's below the demand curve and above the price, but the price is higher now. It's PW plus T. So the areas 1 and 2 are the areas that are below the demand curve and above the price. And then above the supply curve but below the price, that's now areas 3 and 4. So we don't have 4, 5, and 6. So we have to get that in here. Well, a part of this is tariff revenue, because a tariff is a tax, and that revenue that gets collected goes to the government. The tariff revenue, tax revenue is going to be generally, it's the amount of the tax times the quantity. So the amount of the tariff here is the vertical distance between these two curves, and then it gets applied to imports, not imports of free trade, but the imports that we observe with in the tariff equilibrium. That's between Q3 and Q4. So tax revenue is always the amount of the tax for a commodity tax, the amount of the tax multiplied by the quantity that gets sold with that tax in place. There's the tax, there's the quantity sold. So that's area 5. Area 5 is going to be tariff revenue. And in free trade, there was no tariff, so there was no tariff revenue. So we put a dash there, there's nothing there. And then we've got areas 4 and 6. And areas 4 and 6 go away. They are neither consumer surplus nor producer surplus. Let's see. Oh, I see. I have a mistake here. That's 3 and 7 for the producer surplus. I think I said that, but then I wrote 4. It's 3 and 7 for the producer surplus with the tariff. So I already have 4 up there. Okay, so we have areas 4 and 6, and they aren't up here with the consumer or producer surplus. They're deadweight loss. Or efficiency loss. And so there's no deadweight loss with free trade, but areas 4 and 6 are deadweight loss with the tariff in place. We can actually tell a little bit of a story here with those 2 areas. Area 4 was consumer surplus, and it's over these areas that it's over these units that now get produced domestically, and it reflects the fact that the domestic supply curve is taller than the world supply curve. The domestic industry will expand output when the price rises due to the tariff, but they're producing steel using more resources than steel makers in the rest of the world. Area 4 represents the value of the extra resources that the domestic firms have to use to produce the extra steel that they are going to with the tariff in place. And those resources have to get paid, they're getting used up, so that can't be producer surplus. So that's a deadweight loss. And then area 6 is on the is above the units that consumers no longer get to consume. So that's a deadweight loss from disrupting consumption of the good. The price goes up, consumers consume less. Because they consume less, they in these units between Q4 and Q2 were producing consumer surplus. They no longer produce the consumer surplus, because those units do not get produced and consumed, so they can't generate any surplus. So what we see here is that a tariff is inefficient in the sense that there are now an area of deadweight loss with the tariff in place. There was no deadweight loss with in free trade. So that's the grounds in which we would say a tariff, like any tax, is going to be inefficient, and that it generates some deadweight loss. There's nothing unique about a tariff. It's one of the taxes. It's a consequence of a tax. And then we also see that domestic production has gone up. So the effect of the tax is this is the protection. If you want to protect the domestic industry, they get to produce more in the equilibrium with the protection in place than without it, than in free trade. So that's the point of trade protection. The tariff does protect the domestic industry, allowing them to produce a larger quantity, so the domestic production goes up. That would also translate to, say, increased employment in the domestic industry. And it does increase the surplus for the domestic industry. The consumer surplus was 3 and 7 in free trade, only 7 with producer surplus, and 3 came from the consumer surplus to the producer surplus. So the tariff trade protection generates a transfer from domestic consumers to domestic producers. And so in that sense, the trade protection is effective in that it does allow the domestic industry to produce more, and it does allow the domestic industry to earn more consumer surplus or producer surplus. But those gains for the domestic industry, certainly the surplus comes at the expense of the consumers, because the consumers no longer get that surplus. So what we see here is areas 3 and 5 are what we would call wealth transfers. They are areas of surplus that shift when we compare the two equilibria. Area 5 goes from the consumers to the government, and then the government could do something with the tariff revenue, maybe they could do something productive, but in this snapshot here, it goes out of this market, so it goes to the government. It's not surplus in this market, but it doesn't go away. That revenue is there with the government. The government could do something with it. And so that's a transfer. And then area 3 is a wealth transfer from consumers to producers. So we can see how it is that the areas 4 and 6, the deadweight loss, that we could say that a tariff would be inefficient. It disrupts or prevents some of the gains from trade that we could have with free trade. So that's the impact of a tariff. Does a tariff actually provide effective protection? It certainly provides protection, assessing whether that protection is worth the cost, because it does come at a cost. The increase in producer surplus and the increase in domestic production comes at a cost. You've got the deadweight loss, you've got less consumer surplus. Whether that protection is worth it is a more of a normative question. The positive economic question that we're examining here is what are the effects of the tariff, and that's what the tariff does.